Hello, my name is Dr. Patel. I'm a GP registrar currently working in Laxey and Village Walk Health Centre. I've put this video together to give you more information about a condition called prediabetes. In order to understand what prediabetes is, we must understand what diabetes is. So in this video, I'll be explaining what exactly diabetes is, how this relates to prediabetes, and some of the things we can do in order to prevent the progression of prediabetes onto diabetes. So stay tuned. Diabetes is a condition that is diagnosed when the body has lost its ability to control the blood sugar level. What's the dangers of this? So we have known for many years that in an individual where there is poor control over blood sugar level over months and years, this will lead on to problems with the heart, this will lead on to problems with the kidneys, and problems with the circulation and nerves in the legs. Okay. On the other hand, prediabetes is when the body is struggling to maintain a good control over the sugar level. Okay. The significance of this is that in individuals who are pre-diabetic, if no lifestyle changes are made, we know that they will most likely go on to develop diabetes in months or years. This is something we want to avoid at all costs. Research has shown that in those who are already diabetic, it's a lot more difficult to revert back to a normal state of sugar control. On the flip side, those who are pre-diabetic, research has shown that the body does respond better when making some lifestyle changes. So it should be easier in theory to revert back to a normal state of sugar control. So that's why it's important to make changes now. Diagnosing prediabetes and diabetes is relatively easy. We use a blood test called HbA1c. You might have come across this blood test when looking on Patient Access. And the chances are you're probably watching this video because we've measured your HbA1c. It's come back in the pre-diabetic range, and a member of staff has directed you to this video. So the time has come in this video where we can focus on what changes we should be making. So here we go. Let's start off with a simple analogy. Let's say you're decorating a room and you want to buy some new furniture. Let's say you're in the furniture shop and you see a piece of furniture you like. How do you know it fits? That's easy. You measure it. So my number one tip in this whole video is we need to measure what you eat by buying a food weighing scale. It is very useful to measure out how much of a particular food you've eaten in grams for two reasons. The first reason is you can keep your dietary habits very consistent. And if you need to make any dietary changes, then at least those changes will be consistent also. Now, the second reason is if you know how much of a food you've eaten in grams, you can compare that on the food packaging label. And from that, you can derive how many calories you've consumed. Alternatively, you can also use apps like MyFitnessPal that can track your calories very precisely and give you a total in one day or week or month or whatever. What if I told you that you can introduce sugar into the body without actually eating sugar? What am I talking about? So carbohydrate is a form of a nutrient that we get from foods such as pasta, rice, bread, and potatoes. Okay. Now, the type or the form of carbohydrate stored in this food is called starch. Starch molecules are large. Okay. Now let's think about what happens when we have a starchy meal. Let's say we're having a baked potato and it goes down our gut, it gets to our intestines, and that's where the digestive process happens. These large starch molecules are broken down into tiny sugar molecules, and that's how you introduce sugar into the body without eating sugar. I feel there is a huge misconception that might be holding us back. Now, over the last few decades of diabetic campaigns, there's been a focus on staying away from sugary foods. Okay, now this leads me on to my second most useful tip of the video. So that's not only to limit sugary foods that I just mentioned, but also limit foods that contain other types of carbohydrates. So these are the foods that I've already mentioned, like potatoes, pasta, rice, and bread. Okay, there are also other foods that contain carbohydrates to a lesser extent, like lentils, beans, and legumes. So you can do a little bit of reading about which foods contain carbohydrates and which don't. When we ask whether you have a good diet and we get a simple response, yes or no, with a few details, it's not actually very informative. And I've come to the conclusion that's probably because our perspectives on what a good diet changes, because it's dependent on our culture, it's dependent on our upbringing, and it's also dependent on our exposure to different sources of information. One of the first things we can do is buying a dedicated food scale. By measuring our meals, we're taking out all the guesswork, okay? And again, going back to perspective, a small meal to someone might be a big meal to somebody else, and vice versa. So by taking out all the guesswork, what we're actually doing is making our meals more consistent. And if we need to make any changes, then we can do so quite easily and also keep the changes consistent. I feel a huge misconception has been created over the last few years when information has been given to limit sugary foods. Now, whilst this is true to a certain extent, what has happened is all our focus has gone to sugary foods like chocolates, cakes, and biscuits, and it's actually been taken away from another important food category, and that is carbohydrates. So carbohydrate is a nutrient that is most commonly found in foods such as bread, potatoes, pasta, and rice. When the carbohydrate is stored in these foods, it's stored as a molecule called starch. Okay. Now, let's think about what happens when we eat one of these foods. Let's say we're having a baked potato, for example, and it makes our way through our gut and it gets to our intestines. Now, these large starch molecules are broken down into tiny sugar molecules, and that's why it's important to have these in mind when we talk about controlling prediabetes and diabetes.